Hello again, and thank you for staying with us. The U.S. government in Kenya has warned of a possible terror attack in the capital city, Nairobi. The American embassy in Nairobi says that terrorist groups are likely to target civilians with little to no warning. Joining us now for more on this is Dr. Jason Musyoka, a senior researcher at the University of Pretoria. Dr. Musyoka, a pleasure to have you on the program this evening. Now, a terrorism threat warning usually indicates the likelihood of a terrorist attack in a particular region. What can we make of the United States warning its citizens in Kenya of this possible terror attack in Nairobi?
So thank you so much, Atlanta. So I think the issue of particularly that part of the world, the Horn of Africa as it's called, it's a very high traffic migration zone, but at the same time, the borders are not very well secured. The major issue, though, has been the porous border between Kenya and Somalia, even though that border is closed. Now, coming back to your point, there has been, yes, the U.S. giving out an alert or a warning that there is a looming terrorism, and that the British have done the same. The UK embassy in Kenya followed suit. So there's a form of intelligence, of course, that they collect, that they're able to convey to the public, and they tend to be pretty accurate on what's going on. So I think there is credibility to the fact that the intelligence seems to suggest that there is a kind of terrorism that could be expected.
Now, generally, a terrorist threat is sufficiently specific on where it threatens death or great bodily injury. And a threat is not insufficient simply because it does not communicate a time or precise manner of execution. Very interestingly is that Washington has flagged these high traffic areas which are frequented by foreigners as well as tourists in Nairobi and elsewhere in Kenya as possible targets for the terror groups.
Yes, I think the history of the country is, if it's anything to go by, I mean, the history of terrorism in Kenya, you do see some trends or patterns, particularly where Western tourists or citizens from the western parts of the world tend to agglomerate. And these tend to be some specific shopping malls in Kenya, some specific hotels, the airports. So these are really your core centers. And the terrorists, remember, there are two layers of terrorism that we see emerging in Kenya. The first is the more grounded terrorism that seeks to simply attack with the intention of killing as many people as they possibly can. But then there is a much more targeted kind of terrorism that targets these establishments that link to Western interests. And we've seen both of them play out in Kenya, both the grounded terrorism as well as the Western interest terrorism. So I think the kind that we now see from the warning that's given by both the US and the UK is perhaps the more targeted. They warn their citizens against agglomerating around specific areas in Nairobi, which again is a very it's a hub of activity, and there's just a lot of human traffic. So I think that at the moment we are looking at potential Western interests, and we pick that as the intelligence suggesting that that's the target.
And speaking about trends, I mean, the warning also comes after that January 2019 attack at a hotel in the capital, Nairobi as well, where 21 people were killed during the siege, which lasted about 20 hours. It's safe to say that with this in mind and this kind of warning in mind, a warning or threat of this nature cannot be taken lightly here.
Yes, I think going all the way back to 2013, which we had a very deadly terrorism attack that took place in one of the shopping malls owned by Western, capitalists, the Westgate Mall, as we call it. So you have, in every major, there's a 2016, there's a 2019. So in every major terrorism attack that we've seen, there has been an alert or a warning. And I think that it's become a norm that, and sometimes, of course, it's been a hit and miss where the warning is given and nothing happens. But maybe just one quick point to make is the fact that where I think that the U.S. or the Western governments fail is a lack of integrating their intelligence with the local governments.
Yeah.
And I think we saw that also here in South Africa last year, in November, I think it was, where the warning is given, the government, South African government is not aware, and then you need to really try and begin to manage the fallout from that kind of threat being given out. And that is unfortunately what we see even in the current alert warning that we see in Kenya, where the Kenyan government itself seems to be a little bit in the dark, and yet foreigners in the country are giving alert and so on. So that has always tended to be a tension between Western powers and the countries which host them.
Now, at the moment, the government of Kenya has remained on high alert with multidisciplinary agency or security teams in Nairobi following these recent cases of muggings to residents as well. What do you make of the Kenyan authorities' own response to this terror alert?
So that that gets to the whole point of defining what terrorism is. And currently, yes, there are the muggings and so on, and that's a form of terrorism. But I think there is an international definition which looks at now the more political violence that is much more focused, well, very tethered around religion as well, but more mobilized against a particular group. And with what has been going on, I think it's just levels of insecurity and so on. The Kenyan government has tended to respond to that. I don't think that the government is well equipped, the Kenyan government, to respond to terrorism of high level like we've seen in the major ones. So I think that is a weak point, and that is where the point I made, that it's very essential to find some form of partnership with the intelligence. And by the way, the UK and the US, they do have a military base in Kenya. It's also the headquarters of the United Nations. So it's a consequential country in terms of Western interests. And the partnership, however, is a blind spot that has not, particularly in terms of response to terrorism.
Now, this comes barely a month after the U.S. Embassy in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, also issued a security alert to its citizens over what it also termed a possible attack. What can we make of the security situation in that country as well, and threats posed by insurgent groups which are operating in that particular region?
The main cause of explosions of terrorism in that region, in Eastern Africa and going all the way to the Horn, is really the political breakdown in Somalia. We've seen some bit of stability, but unfortunately, any country that is within the region is exposed to the fallout of the clans and the infighting within Somalia that spill over to the neighboring countries. And particularly now, given the East African community, there is an integration, regional integration that has deepened, and opening of the borders. That becomes even more risky, because to what extent do you manage crossing of borders of genuine labor force, genuine migrants, and also terrorists? That has been a key challenge, which is very difficult to manage. So again, to answer your question directly, in Tanzania, Uganda as well, Ethiopia, all those countries are very vulnerable because of the political situation in Somalia, which unfortunately we don't know, at the end is not foreseeable yet.
That was University of Pretoria senior researcher Dr. Jason Musyoka, of course, giving us some insight into that situation, that terror alert being issued by the U.S. government out in Nairobi in Kenya.